There have been thousands of methods of execution throughout the long and brutal history of human civilization. Beheading, crucifixion, burning, impalement, drawing and quartering, but somewhere in the annals of recorded cruelty, the ancient Persians devised a method so methodical, so patient, so utterly calculated in the way it transformed a living human being into something unrecognizable over days and weeks of conscious suffering that even historians accustomed to the worst of antiquity tend to read accounts of it and simply stop, unable to immediately continue, because what the Persians called Scaphism, what history remembers as the boats, was not merely an execution, it was a philosophy of punishment taken to its most nightmarish possible conclusion. To understand why the Persians developed Scaphism, you first have to understand the culture that produced it. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen by the 5th century BC. A civilization of staggering administrative sophistication that governed dozens of peoples across 3 continents, that built roads and postal systems and legal codes that the Greeks and Romans would later imitate and admire, and that believed at its very core in a cosmic moral order in which justice was not merely a social convenience, but a divine obligation, which meant that certain crimes demanded not merely death, but a punishment so extreme and so visible that it would resonate across the moral universe as a proportionate response to the transgression committed. Persian royal justice was never designed to be quiet or private. It was a public instrument of absolute power, a theatrical demonstration that the great king's authority extended not just over the lives of his subjects, but over the manner and duration of their deaths. And the historical record is filled with examples of Persian kings ordering punishments of extraordinary elaborateness. Xerxes had engineers whipped, and the Hellespont itself symbolically flogged when a storm destroyed his bridge. Darius had rebels impaled by the thousands, and recorded the fact with evident satisfaction on the cliffs at Behistun. And for the very worst offenders, those who had betrayed the king personally, who had committed acts of treachery so severe they could not be answered by mere death, something else entirely had been designed. The mechanism of Scaphism was deceptively simple in its construction and almost incomprehensibly sophisticated in its cruelty. The condemned person was stripped naked and forcibly restrained between 2 boats, or in some accounts, 2 hollowed-out tree trunks of roughly matching size, the upper boat fitted over the lower like a lid, with holes cut to allow the victim's head, hands and feet to protrude outside the wooden shell, while the rest of the body was enclosed in the dark, airless space between the 2 hulls, floating on a stagnant pond or swamp, unable to move, unable to escape, unable to do anything except experience with absolute clarity exactly what was happening to them. Before we go any further into the world that built this punishment, before we walk into the Persian royal court, before we meet the man who died in the boats, if this is the kind of history that holds you, the kind that does not look away and does not sanitize the truth of what human beings have done to each other, take 5 seconds right now to subscribe to this channel and leave a like, because everything that comes next is exactly why this channel exists. The most detailed historical account of Scaphism comes from the Greek historian Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, who describes the execution of a Persian soldier named Mithridates, not to be confused with the later Pontic king, who had been rash enough to boast publicly at a royal banquet that he, not the king's brother Cyrus, had delivered the killing blow at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC, a claim so politically dangerous and personally insulting to the Persian royal family that Artaxerxes II, one of the most powerful kings in the world, personally ordered Mithridates subjected to Scaphism, and what Plutarch records about the 17 days that followed remains one of the most disturbing passages in all of ancient literature. The Battle of Cunaxa was itself one of the most dramatic events of the ancient world. Cyrus the Younger, the Persian prince who had hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries in a bid to overthrow his brother Artaxerxes II, came agonizingly close to winning before being killed in the fighting, and the aftermath of the battle, which included the famous retreat of the 10,000 Greeks, recorded by Xenophon in the Anabasis, left a court seething with wounded pride and a king who had been publicly challenged for his throne by his own brother, which meant that when Mithridates made his drunken boast about who had really killed Cyrus, he was not merely being tactless, he was inserting himself into the most sensitive wound in the entire Persian royal psyche. The process of Scaphism began before the victim was even placed in the boats. The condemned was forcibly fed enormous quantities of milk and honey, a mixture so sweet and so voluminous that it induced violent, uncontrollable diarrhea almost immediately, and the guards did not stop when the victim vomited or when his bowels emptied. They simply fed him more because the entire logic of what came next depended on the body's natural digestive processes continuing at maximum intensity. And because the milk and honey served a second purpose beyond filling the bowels, it was also rubbed and poured liberally over the victim's exposed extremities. The face, the hands, the feet, every inch of skin visible through the holes in the boats. Once restrained between the boats and placed on the stagnant water, the condemned was left, and it is the word left that carries the full horror of Scaphism. Because this was not a punishment that required ongoing intervention or administration. It was a punishment that simply required time and the cooperation of the natural world, which cooperated with terrible efficiency. The milk and honey coating? The exposed skin drew insects within hours. Flies first, then biting insects of every kind, and the warmth of the enclosed wooden shell, combined with the body heat of the victim and the constant flow of excrement created, within the first day, conditions inside the boats that accelerated everything that followed, in ways the Persians had clearly studied and understood. The insects were not incidental to Scaphism, they were the mechanism, the active agent of the punishment, and the Persians had chosen the stagnant swamp setting with precise deliberation, because stagnant water in the warm Persian climate was and is a breeding ground of extraordinary density for the specific insects that made Scaphism work as a sustained method of execution. Flies that laid eggs in the warm, excrement-filled space between the hulls, in the folds of skin covered in honey and milk, in the eyes and mouth and ears of a victim who could not move to brush them away, and whose helplessness meant that within 2 or 3 days, the interior of the boats had become something that no clinical description can fully convey, and that the human imagination recoils from even in abstract contemplation. The progression of Scaphism followed a hideous internal logic. The insects bred inside the hull fed on the victim's flesh and waste, their larvae hatching and feeding in the warmth and nourishment of the enclosed space. The constant forced feeding of milk and honey continued every day because the executioners returned daily not to monitor the victim's suffering, but to administer more of the same mixture, ensuring the diarrhea continued, ensuring the food source for the insects was replenished, ensuring the victim did not die of dehydration before the full process had run its course, and the victim, conscious throughout because the mixture, while causing extreme digestive distress, did not cause unconsciousness, experienced every hour of every day with complete awareness. The daily return of the guards to administer more food and milk was one of the most psychologically devastating elements of the entire punishment, because it meant that Scaphism was not a sentence handed down and then left to run its course. It was an actively maintained process, one that required human decision-making to continue each day, which meant that each morning when the guards returned, the victim knew with absolute certainty that the people applying this punishment to him had looked at what they had created the day before, had assessed it, had decided it was not yet sufficient, and had chosen to extend it, a daily renewal of the death sentence that communicated, more clearly than any words, the scale of the crime the Persians believed had been committed. Plutarch, writing his account of the death of Mithridates in his Life of Artaxerxes, describes the victim's flesh as putrefying and gangrening inside the boats as swarms of vermin consumed it from within, the skin rotting off in sections while the victim remained alive and conscious. A description that modern medical professionals who have analysed the account confirm is entirely consistent with what would happen to a human body subjected to those specific conditions over a period of days. The combination of insect larvae consuming living tissue, the constant exposure to bodily waste, the absence of movement or cleaning, and the regular introduction of food, meaning the body could not shut down from starvation even as it was being systematically destroyed from the outside in. After approximately a week in the boats, survivors of other similar accounts, because Scaphism appears to have been used more than once in Persian history, describe a state that can only be called a living death. The victim was technically still alive, still breathing, still capable of crying out when touched, but the combination of extreme physical destruction, constant pain, dehydration despite the forced liquid intake, and the psychological devastation of complete helplessness had produced a dissociative state in which the boundaries between waking consciousness and something else had dissolved entirely, a state the ancient sources describe with a combination of clinical detachment and poorly concealed horror that tells you more about how Scaphism affected the people who witnessed it than almost anything else into the record. One of the most revealing details in the ancient accounts of Scaphism is the consistent description of observers, Persian courtiers, soldiers, even officials who had ordered the punishment, turning away, refusing to approach the boats after the first few days, because what floated on that swamp was no longer recognizable as the person who had been placed there, and the smell, described in sources as detectable from a significant distance by the third or fourth day, meant that even the guards responsible for the daily feedings reportedly performed their duty as quickly as possible and retreated, suggesting that even within the culture that had invented and sanctioned this punishment, there was a visceral human response to its reality that no amount of political justification could entirely suppress. It would be a mistake to present Scaphism as uniquely Persian, in its cruelty without acknowledging the broader context of ancient punishment. The Greeks had their own innovations in torture and execution, including the brazen bull of Phalaris, in which victims were sealed inside a hollow bronze statue, heated from below until they roasted alive. The Romans would later develop crucifixion into a sustained multi-day execution and perfected the arena as a theatre of public death. The Assyrians practiced impalement with documented industrial efficiency, and virtually every ancient civilization had developed methods of execution that, viewed from a modern perspective, represent a sustained and systematic application of human ingenuity to the problem of inflicting maximum suffering. But Scaphism stands apart even in this company because of its duration, its patience, and its almost agricultural quality, as if the Persians had understood suffering as something that could be cultivated and harvested over time. Plutarch records that Mithridates survived in the boats for 17 days. 17 days during which the Persian court, by all accounts, continued its normal functions. The king held his audiences, the armies drilled, the merchants traded, and somewhere on a stagnant pond within earshot of civilization, a man who had said the wrong thing at a banquet experienced in 17 consecutive daily increments the full weight of what it meant to have personally offended the great king of Persia, a duration so extreme that even Plutarch, who was not a squeamish writer and who described plenty of violence in his historical works without evident discomfort, frames the account of the 17th day with a restraint that reads less like authorial detachment and more like a man who has reached the limits of what he is willing to put into words. The particular tragedy of Mithridates, and it is a tragedy regardless of what one thinks of his boasting, is that he had done something genuinely brave at Cunaxa, had thrown a javelin with enough accuracy and force to wound or kill one of the most powerful princes in the world, had survived a battle that killed thousands, and had then undone all of it with a single night of wine-loosened pride at a banquet where he had forgotten, or chosen to forget, that in the Persian royal court the truth was never as important as the story the king needed to be true, and that claiming credit for the death of the king's own brother, even truthfully, even accurately, was not a fact that could be spoken aloud and survived. The social mechanism that made Mithridates' boast so lethal is worth understanding in detail, because it reveals something important about the political logic that produced Scaphism as a tool of Persian statecraft. In the Achaemenid court, the king's narrative of events was not merely the official version, but the only version that could be publicly spoken. And any individual who contradicted that narrative, even in a private conversation, let alone at a public banquet full of witnesses, was not merely being tactless, but was committing a form of treason against the cosmic order the king embodied, which meant that Artaxerxes' response to Mithridates was not personal cruelty, but institutional necessity, a demonstration that the king's story about reality was more powerful than any individual's lived experience of it. The question that historians and classicists have debated for centuries, whether Scaphism actually happened as described, or whether Plutarch and the other sources who mention it were engaging in the ancient tradition of attributing extreme cruelty to foreign peoples as a form of cultural othering, is one that cannot be definitively resolved with the evidence currently available. But the balance of scholarly opinion in the modern era has shifted toward treating the account as at minimum plausible and possibly accurate, on the grounds that the specific details Plutarch provides are consistent with what would actually happen biologically, that the Persian cultural context makes the punishment conceptually coherent rather than fantastical, and that the account names a specific historical individual at a specific historical battle with verifiable dates and participants, giving it an evidentiary texture that purely invented atrocity stories typically lack. Mithridates was not the only recorded victim of Scaphism. Ancient sources including Diodorus Siculus suggest the method was used on at least one other occasion by Persian authorities, and the level of logistical preparation it required. The specific boats, the specific location, the daily administration of the feeding regimen, the need for guards to maintain the punishment over days or weeks suggests that it was not improvised for a single case, but was an established procedure that the Persian judicial system knew how to implement, complete with the institutional knowledge of how long different individuals might survive under the conditions, what modifications might be necessary, and how to ensure the punishment lasted long enough to serve its deterrent function without ending prematurely. The deepest and most disturbing aspect of Scaphism is not its physical mechanics, but its philosophical foundation. The Persians were Zoroastrians who believed in Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of truth and light, and in the cosmic battle between truth and the lie, Asher versus Druj, a moral framework that was in many ways more sophisticated and more genuinely ethical than the religious systems of many of their contemporaries. And yet this same framework produced Scaphism, because within Zoroastrian moral logic, someone who had committed a sufficiently serious transgression against the divine order, who had lied in the face of the king's truth, who had betrayed the cosmic structure, had placed themselves outside the normal moral protections that governed human treatment of other humans, had made themselves into something that deserved not death, but transformation into the thing they had become through their transgression. The account of Scaphism travelled through the ancient and medieval world with remarkable persistence, copied from source to source, translated from Greek to Latin to Arabic to the vernacular languages of medieval Europe, each retelling adding or subtracting details but preserving the essential outline. And the fact that so many different literate cultures across so many centuries chose to copy and preserve this particular account, when there were thousands of historical episodes they could have omitted, tells you something important about what Scaphism represents in the human imagination. It is not just a historical curiosity, but a kind of limit case, a thought experiment about the boundaries of human cruelty that every civilization that encounters the account finds itself unable to simply put down and walk away from. Modern forensic medicine and entomology, the study of insects in legal and medical contexts, have provided a clinical validation of Plutarch's account that is in some ways more disturbing than the original description, because the biological processes involved in Scaphism are not exotic or theoretical, but are the same processes that occur in any body left exposed to warm, moist conditions with access to insects. Myiasis, the infestation of living tissue by fly larvae, is a well-documented medical condition that, in severe untreated cases, can consume significant quantities of living flesh within 72 hours. And the specific combination of factors in Scaphism, the warmth, the moisture, the constant food source, the inability of the victim to dislodge larvae, would create conditions of extreme meiosis far beyond anything that occurs accidentally, meaning the Persians had, whether through deliberate experimentation or accumulated observation, identified and deliberately created the optimal conditions for this specific biological process. The legacy of Scaphism, and of Persian royal punishment more broadly, runs in a direct and traceable line through the history of human rights and legal theory. Because every civilization that recorded and transmitted the account of Scaphism used it as a reference point for the concept of punishment that has crossed a line that has gone beyond justice into something else. And it is not a coincidence that the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment that appears in the English Bill of Rights of 1689 and later in the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution presents at its philosophical core a direct response to exactly the kind of punishment Scaphism exemplified, a punishment designed not to end suffering, but to maximize and extend it, to transform the condemned not merely into a corpse, but into a living demonstration of the punisher's absolute power over the punished. The Persian punishment called the boats endures in the historical record not because it was the most common form of ancient execution. It was rare, reserved for cases of extraordinary perceived transgression, but because it represents something that the human mind recognizes instinctively as a boundary, the point at which punishment stops being about justice and starts being about something else entirely, about power and demonstration and the need to make suffering visible and legible and permanent. And in that recognition, across every culture and every century that has encountered the account of Mithridates floating on his stagnant Persian pond for 17 days, there is a consistent and unambiguous response that transcends historical distance and cultural difference. A response that is perhaps the most honest thing the study of ancient history ever produces in us, not detachment, not academic analysis, not the comfortable separation of then from now, but the simple, visceral, and deeply human understanding that we are looking at something that should never have happened, and that the fact that it did happen is a truth about our species that no amount of civilization has yet fully answered.